We are going to start today with a morning keynote by Joan Lombardi, PhD, who's the editor of that journal. She's an international expert on development and social policy, and she's going to give us a kind of a different sort of a big picture overview. We've been hearing over the last couple of days from a lot of the scientists and researchers. Joan occupies a different place in the early childhood development equation. Over the past 40 years, she has made significant contributions in child and family policy as an innovative leader, as a policy advisor to national and international organizations. She was in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services as the first Deputy Assistant Secretary for Early Childhood Development in the Obama administration. She served in a similar capacity in the Clinton administration, the Bill Clinton administration. She's been the founding chair of the Birth to Five Policy Alliance and is the founder of Global Leaders for Young Children. Joan Lombardi is the author of numerous publications, including Time to Care, Redesigning Childcare to Promote Education, Support Families, and Build Communities, and co-author of Beacon of Hope, The Promise of Early Head Start for America's Youngest Children. She is going to begin with a presentation to lay down some language and history and ideas, or language and ideas. We may get to the history later. Then she and I will begin a conversation, and then we'll open it up to the room. And we're here for the next hour or so together. So please welcome Joan Lombardi.
Morning. Third days when I was teaching preschool, the first week of school for little children, the third day is when they cried. Because they realized that, like, they were there now. And I don't have the science behind that. That was, an experiential. So I don't want any of you to cry. I'm really delighted to be here. I'm really honored to be here because I think this is a very special group, and it's not something that I say every time, but right now, journalists, I think, are the absolute pioneer on the front lines, whatever you want to say, for democracy. And your role in this, in telling the stories and giving voice to people that have no voice, in truth-telling, is so critical. So I want to applaud you from the bottom of my heart and thank you for choosing this profession and going on the journey of truth-telling, because I think that's what journalism really should all be about, not taking a political point of view, but really trying to seek the truth like a scientist, actually, and reporting on it. So thank you very much. As Bruce said, I've been in the field for a long, long time. My mother says that in 1965, I came home. This is her story, not mine. I don't actually remember it. I came home and I told her that they were starting this little preschool program in the church across from my high school or near my high school, and I wanted to volunteer for that. That was 1965. That was Head Start, which turned out to be the premier early childhood program in the country. And that was high school. I ended up going to college and taking some time off to actually focus on high school kids. But it's been a long, long journey. And what I want to do with you this morning, in some ways, this framing probably should have been first. But now you're so enmeshed in the science and experts in what you've already heard. I want to talk a little bit about the bigger panoramic picture of what's going on in early childhood. And please stop me along the way if you have questions, because I think I'd prefer it that way. So the goal of the presentation originally was to talk about the journal that came out on Thursday. So that's the goal, and I do hope that if you haven't read it, you will read it, that it's a resource that is accessible, which is, I think, important, because if you're really serious about this issue, you're reading some of the scientific journals that may not feel as accessible. Our goal is to make this information more accessible And then your goal is to make it even more accessible to the general public. So I want to share what's in the journal, walk you through it. But first, I want to talk a little bit about some of the challenges and opportunities that I see in the field. I want to start with the number of babies born every year. We've got about 140 million babies born a year around the world. I think that's an important number. If I was you and I was reporting on early childhood in a country, I would want to know how many babies are born in that country. I often ask advocates, do you know how many babies are born in your community and in your country? And if you can't say that, I mean, that to me is the most basic thing. So about more than 550 million children under 5. What's difficult about the numbers, and if you want this demographic information on the countries that you're reporting on, I really would turn to the UNICEF State of the World's Children, which has demographic information by country. I think it's a tremendous source for you. What's difficult about the numbers is that we still have very high percentage of children whose births are never registered. And that that has implications for the rest of their lives with going to school, with getting benefits. So birth registration is a big piece of the early childhood, has to be a big piece of the early childhood picture. We've had a tremendous success in the fact that we've dropped the number of children under 5 that are dying before their 5th birthday has dropped by 53%. Between 1990 and 2015, there's still about 6 million children that under 5 that die each year. So we still have child survival issues, but we have made progress, and I think it's important to celebrate progress as we look at the rest of the demographics. We still have about 150 million children under 5 that are stunted for growth, 42 million overweight. So the story about malnutrition is a story of underweight and stunting, but it's also an increasing story about obesity, which is also an interesting story to cover, I think. The burden of risk for poverty and stunting, and some other speakers probably mentioned this, estimated about 250 million children, 43% according to the Lancet, that came out in 2016 in low and middle income countries are at risk for healthy development. And those were just looking at poverty and nutrition in their estimates. If we also include violence at home in communities in their countries, the increasing number of families with children migrating and displaced, and obviously this is an issue of today. Too many children left at home alone, whether their parents are migrating, whether their parents are working, and the extended family is no longer with them, and an increasing number of children affected by natural disasters, lack of water and sanitation. If you add in those elements, I think we all believe, the percentage of children at risk for healthy development is much higher. The good news, and I know that Chuck Nelson was here yesterday, is that the evidence continues to grow from neuroscience, molecular biology, developmental psychology, economics. You'll hear all that. I'm not going to talk about it, but from my perspective, it is what's making the difference in getting visibility around this issue. When we talk about early childhood, I don't know how much the issue of what is it, what age period are we talking about, has come up. I like to think of it as prenatal through early primary. And I say prenatal, and every time I say that, people say, well, what about preconception? Because the health of adolescents are so important to the long-term development. But it more and more, it's these 3 periods, prenatal to age 3, preschool, and then early primary, that's getting the focus. And there are different policies that are emerging. Our goal, what's the goal of early childhood? And this is basic, but our goal is to increase the protective factors and decrease the risk factors. In a simple way, that's what we're all about. And every program and every policy should be judged that way. Unfortunately, we see the inequality gap emerge very early, and this is why we really need to focus early. This is from a study in the US where the gap in, this was cognitive development in 9 months and 24 months, was showing very early on. This is a national data set in the US, showing us that, and this was based on poverty levels, that we have to begin to think about this much earlier than preschool. Same kind of data showing across different countries in Latin America. This is data from Nicaragua, Ecuador, Peru, and Colombia. So obviously the inequalities start very young. The solutions are still lagging behind what we know. And I had many conversations with people this morning. If you look at preschool coverage, just that middle period, we still have, even though we're reaching half the kids in some countries, if you drill down on this data, what you'd see is the poorest kids, of course, are getting the least services, and that the quality of the services are strained. So even when we're reaching children, we're not reaching them with the kind of quality services which will result in the economic investments that we're all using as our arguments. If they're not good quality, we're not going to get those results. When we look at the children under 3, and we've been trying to track policies for children under 3, there's much less attention to the children under 3 than there is to the preschool child, which is interesting because if you think about the gap that I just showed, it's really too late, and not too late, it's never too late. But it's a shame to wait till then to do your interventions. This is a diagram, and someone may have shown this in the last 2 days, of the Nurturing Care Framework that came out by WHO. And what's important to me here is that it's not saying one of these things matter, it's saying all of these things matter. Health, nutrition, responsive caregiving, early learning, safety, and security. They're indivisible. They're indivisible. The reason they're indivisible is because the domains of development are indivisible. So you have to work on multiple domains. You can't just do one thing, and that makes the field challenging, but it is the reason that we're seeing amazing growth in services for children under 3, and we're seeing it from multiple sectors. We're seeing it from the education people who are saying, if you want to really make a difference in learning, you've got to start early. We're seeing it from the health people who are saying, finally, it's not just about keeping kids alive, it's helping them thrive. We're seeing it from social protection and child protection. And in the social protection area, I think what we're really seeing is the importance of creating an enabling environment for families, because it is that enabling environment for families that results in child development. So you can't separate that either. We've got increased attention from policymakers. If you look at the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, I could go through every one of them and say how they relate to young children. And I say young children, I don't say ECD. I don't like the term ECD. They're letters. They don't mean anything. I think it's really important to talk about this issue in the words of children. But we have integrated goals around healthy child development in the education goals in Goal 4. But the real issue here is that every one of these is related to child development. We've had renewed attention to research and measurement, several Lancets in child development, and I can't help but recognize Sally Grantham McGregor, who I know you heard from yesterday, who's just been an absolute pioneer in this area. The good news is that we've got the scientific publications 7-fold increase over the last 15 years. And what to me is exciting is that the research is not just coming out of the US, that we're seeing research emerge from the global south that I think it may be much more applicable to the situations that we're trying to encourage. Increased screening, evaluation, and monitoring. We've also got new networks and new champions. The Global Partnership to End Violence Against Children, Scaling Up Nutrition, the Early Childhood Network. We've got early childhood networks in every region. So there are key people in your region that you need to connect with for the stories you want to write about, because they can then connect you to the right people. And so we can provide you with those networks. The good news to me is an infrastructure is emerging in the field that can help be a conduit of information. Every day we hear about new champions, business leaders, sports figures, entertainers that are interested in this issue. That's very different from the day that I came home from school and said they're starting a little preschool in my neighborhood. And it's been a groundswell. What's also exciting is we're moving from single program thinking to scale. So for years and years and years, especially globally, we saw programs here, many funded by foundations and charitable organizations. The world has changed now to take what we're learning and replicate that and scale that. Now that's got a lot of challenges, but we're seeing people, countries use various platforms to do the scaling, whether it's health, education, child protection again, or social protection. We're also seeing a movement to what many people call place-based strategies. So rather than just focusing on a single program, they're focusing on how do we change the trajectory for children in the whole community? And I'll show you a few examples of that. So the intensity and the quality matter. You'll hear a lot about quality, and people say, well, what does that mean? And what we mean by quality is, if you're doing a home visiting program, for example, the number of visits, the length of the program, whether they come or not matters. I mean, I love it when people do, I don't love it, when people do research on programs and they say there's no impact, but they didn't look at whether the kids came to the program. So those implementation issues matter. And training, support, supervision, and the caseloads of the people that are doing the work matter. Again, we're looking at a lot of infrastructure, emerging coordinated governance, quality assurance systems, workforce supports, new financing strategies, and a big effort on data collection. So in a nutshell, I think there's a new vision that's emerging. The old think was learning begins at school. The new think is learning begins at birth. We used to think health or education, which one is priority for children? We know now from a developmental perspective, it's health and education. We used to think about our programs, well, we have a program that focuses on the child. We have a program that focuses on the parent. That kind of thinking is old. We know now you have to have a whole family approach, because it is, again, that enabling environment of the family, and the family supported by the community, that makes the difference. Short-term interventions, when Head Start started in the US, we thought we could end poverty in 8 weeks of a summer program. Nice try. We know now you can't do it. It's not an inoculation. This is not a shot in the arm. You have to stay with children for a long period of time and their parents. So this continuity from prenatal to 8 is critical. And I'm not spending a lot of time talking about early primary, but I could. Because if we do all this wonderful programming for kids under 5 and they go into some of the worst schools in any country, then we're not gonna, you can't expect the kind of results that we're hoping to get. We had a lot of talk for years about, do we focus on quality or do we focus on access? Silly debate. You have to focus on both. Of course, we want more children to have services, but we want them to have good services or we won't get the results. This is a little bit more technical. We used to look at data for compliance. Is this program meeting certain standards? I think now we're looking at data for improvement. Rather than the gotcha mentality of monitoring, I think we're trying to say to people, look at your data and learn from your data and then improve your program. Not look at your data, if it looks bad, we're gonna close you down. And I think that's a very different shift in thinking. And so that's the revolution. Let me just turn to the magazine. I'm really delighted that you all have it, and I do urge you to read it. This is the 20th anniversary issue of the journal that the foundation's been doing. Prior to that, they did a newsletter that was very much for their own grantees. And so 20 years ago, they took the step of focusing on what was going on around the world, and they did many, many thematic issues on specific topics. we have changed that format. This now is an effort to look around the world and say, what's going on? Give me the panorama picture of what's going on, which is very different. If we look back over the years, somebody did a word cloud. I don't know how to do these things, but one of our editors did it. There were certain words that were in every issue, starting back from the beginning. The word community, the word family, the word parents, the word education. And I mean, there's lots of other new words that emerge over time, but I think there's something about the consistency of those words that really do speak about what the field is about and what's important. If I walk you through the sections, I want to just walk you through some of this. There are 4 sections in the journal, and I hope that helps you frame your own stories. We have 4 examples of what we're calling leaders who are making a difference on this, and I'll talk a little bit about them. We start the journal with an article by the president of Colombia and his effort to create a program called Zero a Siempre, and I know Marta Codino has been here, and I may have talked about the Colombia program, but what we're seeing is presidents stepping up and making a difference, first ladies stepping up and making a difference. We then move to I think we skipped one. Let me go back. Can I go back? This is the Secretary, the Director General of WHO, Dr. Tedros, who stepped forward and sends a resounding message to the health community that it's not just about physical health, it's about development, which we think is an important message. I always get tripped up by this. Got it. A very timely article by David Miliband, the head of the International Rescue Committee, who clearly talks about the tragedies that are unfolding, whether you're talking about the southern borders of the United States or the Rohingya crisis in Bangladesh, the effect that that's having. In that article, he also talks about the new grant that the MacArthur Foundation has given to the International Rescue Committee in Sesame Street. They won a $100 million prize to bring the lessons of early childhood into several countries in the Middle East, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, and Lebanon, and to meet and to spread to at least around 9 million children. So these are not small efforts anymore. These are huge efforts that are going on around the world. We have the 4th and last article in the leadership section is from Marta Pais, who is the UN representative on violence against children. And again, the perspective coming from the child protection area. In that article, she talks about the fact that we've got an estimated billion children affected by violence. So violence prevention is a big part of this. It's much harder to make a difference in the lives of the children once they experience violence. The goal really has to be prevention, and that's what early childhood is all about. We then move to scaling. We've got 8 articles in here about scaling. I'm not going to go through them all, but what's exciting is we have them from Brazil to Bhutan and beyond. And so you can see that this movement is happening around the world. What's interesting, and I was telling someone this morning about this is early still. So when the person wrote the article on Criança Feliz, which I know we have some reporters here from Brazil, it was only 16 months into the program. So one of my concerns is that we judge these things very early in the process and don't give them time to grow. And it's the political pressure. If we're going to invest, as we move to invest public money, there's a tremendous pressure to get results and get results quick. And I think all of us that have been in the field for a long time, I respect that, but I also worry about it. If you look at this article by the early childhood director in Bhutan, where they are integrating early childhood into the goal that emerged in 2008 in Bhutan around gross national happiness. So their parenting program that they're developing in Bhutan is really trying to integrate the parenting issues into the culture that is also emerging around gross national happiness, which puts much more focus on culture, social emotional development. So we can't take a program that's developed here and plunk it into another place and think it's going to make a difference. It's got to be culturally sensitive. This is a program in Mozambique, and this is an article by PATH, which is an international NGO that's trying to integrate parenting into the health system, which is, again, part of one of the most important platforms we can use. We then turn to some articles that aren't examples of scaling, but they're the issues that we're seeing with scaling. And one of the biggest issues that we're seeing with scaling is the capacity of the workforce. So we're expecting an awful lot, and we're not providing any supports for the workforce. They are often poorly compensated, most often poorly compensated, with not enough training, with not enough coaching, with not enough supervision. And then we're expecting them to give us a 1 to 10 return on investment. And so this article is a series of case studies. We have, the Bernard Van Leer Foundation has started a workforce initiative. We have a website about this that you can draw from that talks about the importance of the workforce, that does case studies on the workforce. And this is an article on 3 of those case studies from Peru, South Africa, and the Ukraine. So again, you can see the global nature of this. We then turn to innovation and have several articles, about 7 articles. Let me tell you about 2 to 3 of them, because I know my time is limited. I'll start with the Arab region, where the Arab Resource Coalition came together to develop a model of parenting that included mothers and fathers. And I think we could have a whole conversation about the importance of fathers and the data on fathers and the importance of making sure that this issue is not a mother issue, it's a family issue. And so this is a model that's just emerging. It's exciting to see a parenting program emerge from a region and where they're taking the people that are trained, the parents that go through the program, and then use them as people who reach other parents. So that's in the Arab region. We then turn to the UK, where the National Lottery put a significant amount of resources into communities, a 10-year investment in 5 communities. It's called Better Start. And again, this is an example of a place-based initiative where they're trying to look at the entire community and make a difference. So this is a Better Start. We have several other articles in there on what we're calling Urban 95. Has that come up at all yesterday? Urban 95 is the Bernard Van Leer effort to look, 95 centimeters is the height of an average 3-year-old. So it's to look at cities from the view of a 3-year-old. And I think we're seeing more and more interest in doing that and looking at the environment, the mobility, the public spaces for children, and this along with the services. So these place-based initiatives are part of the innovation going on around the world. We have 5 short takes in here, small, even shorter articles, and I'll just mention a few. One on pollution by one of the lead scientists on pollution, Peter Ladrigan, who is the chair of the Lancet Commission on Pollution and Health. Pollution is responsible for 9 million deaths a year, more than AIDS, TB, and malaria. So it's a serious issue. It's going to be a growing issue, and it's particularly harmful in the first 1,000 days of life. We then turn to an article on WASH. WASH is the acronym for Water, Sanitation, and Hygiene. And why we think this is so important: you can have the best nutrition program in the world, but if you're not paying attention to water sanitation and hygiene, what happens? Kids get diarrhea and you lose all your nutrition. So it's having a huge impact, the lack of quality water, on efforts to reduce infant mortality and deworm children. So we've got to use this platform as part of the picture. We then turn to 2 articles on the topic of childcare for working families. We have one from a business perspective, how to convince businesses that childcare is important. And when I use the term childcare, I mean caring for children while their parents are working. This is from the article on that was done by an organization called WeGo, Women in the Informal Sector, women who work in the market, women who work in the factories, women who pick our vegetables, and the importance of focusing on their childcare needs, because by and large around the world they're bringing their children to work without adequate protections for their safety or early stimulation. And then finally we end with an article that emerged from a conference, first-time conference in South Africa, called Think Future. This is from a group that was developed in South Africa, emerged from South Africa, called Innovation Edge. They put on a conference to think about where do we go in the future. And the article ends with a story, metaphor that was talked about at the conference by this gentleman, Dave Duarte, who used a fire metaphor to talk about what's going on in the field. And he said we need 3 kinds of fires. We need wildfires that help inspire people. We need bonfires that bring people together in a communal way. And we need fireworks, events like this, that stimulate thinking and help us. They may be one-time efforts, but help us to move the field forward. I think you're part of the fireworks. And I think you can make a huge difference in this world of young children. We need you. We need you desperately to talk about these issues and get them more front page coverage. We have several issues of the past issues of the journal on our website. Use them as a spark for your own efforts to write about young children and families. And to me, this is what it's all about. It's about the interaction between parent and child. That's what makes your brain grow. That's what stimulates neurons. And without that, I think children will not have reach the developmental potential that we think they will. So thank you.
Thank you, Joan. For the record, fireworks are exciting, but I also think of this as a nice, cozy bonfire that's
Good.
pulling this wonderful community of journalists and ECD folks together. Back when I used to report on education and social policy and things like that, which is really a long time ago, scarily long time ago, if I spoke to education people, they would speak about small people, young children in terms of preschool and education and a little head start. If you spoke to pediatricians, they would be talking about health. If you spoke to lawyers, they'd be talking about children's rights. We've been getting, for the last couple of days, a very different sense when we talk about early childhood development of a kind of an integrated field that brings all these silos of perspectives together. How the hell did we end up here? How did this develop into such a coherent and exciting field?
Well, it's interesting. If I go back to the Head Start example from 1965, that program, really interesting, that program was a preschool program, but it had a very strong requirement on families being involved, family voice, family empowerment. It was very much linked to health. So right from the early days, there was this sense of comprehensive, integrated services, which I don't think you got in the education sector. Yeah. And you certainly didn't get development from a pediatric. And if you go even earlier, you hardly got a discussion from your obstetrician about the person that was about to be born. So all of this was very, very siloed. I mean, and it still is to some degree across.
Yeah.
What made it change? I think that the fact is we can't get there without each other. And one of the difficulties of this whole topic of integrated services is what does it mean? So in Colombia and in Chile, they created, councils where the ministers come together to talk about young children or their designees. That's one part of it. But the real issue is at the service delivery level. Are you talking to a mother about the importance of breastfeeding, but also talking to her about what that means for her relationship with her child? And I think that's different.
Yeah. And over the last couple of decades, what do you see as the historic markers from which this has sprung?
I think the emergence of the brain science has been huge. And I was reflecting this morning, it was a spark, I was reflecting, I don't know how many of you have ever seen the Newsweek, cover of Newsweek that came out, and I believe it was the mid-90s, with the brain on the cover, and the child on the cover about brain development. That wasn't me talking in a small little group with a group of early childhood people about young children. That was on the cover of Newsweek. And the Carnegie Foundation at the time had done a report called Starting Points. So although there were programs that had emerged from the 60s, not just in the US, one of the biggest programs in the world is the program in India, the Integrated Child Development program in India, and there was many, many programs emerging through the 60s and 70s in Latin America and around the world. But there was something about the brain science, there was something about the economic arguments that really propelled this.
Let me ask you a gentle but skeptical journalist type question. Is there any danger that ECD can become seen as too broad a lens or as a kind of convenient basket into which to throw every kind of social progress that we want to make? And how do we keep it from how do we keep it focused and not just becoming a buzzword for social policy in general?
We have a dilemma. I mean, I'll be honest with you. I think we have a dilemma because we can't overpromise. And so you have these economic studies coming out that we all use. But we also know that when you go to scale with anything, there is a tendency to dilute what was originally making the impact. So the caseloads grow, the qualifications for the staff, well, maybe we can get by with somebody less qualified, it'll be cheaper, we could use volunteers, which you can't, not in the long term. And so that is a concern.
Yeah. One of the things that you talk about a lot, or that's dealt with a lot in this issue, that we haven't really talked about so far this weekend, is the role of leadership, which I would take to mean scientific leadership, community leadership, national leadership in pushing these forward. All of us here who are reporters deal with leaders, whether it's at the local level or the national level. A lot of what they say is what counts as news. How should we think about the role of leaders around the world in this issue, and how do we assess whether political leadership or social policy leadership in particular are really doing good work or are simply ticking a political box?
Yeah, that's really a very good question. I think people like me, we're not the leaders anymore. The leadership is now coming from people that are much higher up. And what their motivations are, I will, assume that their motivations are good, and that they wanna have a long-term impact. But I think that means that we've got to hold their feet to the fire, that they're not just talking. We have a lot of people that talk about this issue now, but then when it comes to the budget, you don't see the investments. And I think you have to call people out on that, because that's not what we want. You can't be for this issue and vote against increasing investments. We can't let that happen.
So if folks are reporting on this stuff, increasing investments is one
Absolutely.
marker of effective leadership and effective change. What are some other markers? What else should we be looking at, whether we're looking at local programs or regional programs?
You know, I think what's hard here, and we were talking about why is there such a big gap between what we know and what's going on, is that it takes generations to change social norms, I think. And the social norm around young children was what? It was they belong to their family, learning starts at school, health is about keeping kids physically healthy. And so and then the world changed and is changing dramatically. And people are moving and they're not with their grandmothers anymore, and grandma's not there to care for their children. I mean, I'm a grandmother. My grandchild's 200 miles away from me. And so, I think that that's one of the challenges, I think, is how we push the boundaries so that these policies change, and we push against the cultural norms that assume that this is all about, a child is better off if they're home until they go to school, as if that's reality for anybody anymore. It's not.
I have a couple more things, and then we'll go to the room. You mentioned in the course of your talk that there are key people in every region. How can our colleagues here find those leaders?
I think we need to give you the list. I mean, it's not always not that simple, but there is a network in the Arab region. There's networks in the Asia Pacific region of early childhood people. And so those networks, then we want to see this happen. It's not happening as much as we would like when it should, but those networks then relate to country networks. So there's a conduit for information, and you have to find that person if you're reporting on any particular country.
So
we can give you those.
Bernard Van Leer
yeah.
can give you regional contacts,
Yes,
and then
yes. Esther Go is here, and we could definitely provide that. But more than that, I think a cold email is not always helpful. I think we're always ready to help you connect with them in a more personal way, so that we make the connection with you. I think a lot of people in my field are not used to talking to reporters. It's scary. It's still scary for me. I don't feel toxic stress, but you feel a little stressed. And so bear with us on that. Help people along. Help people learn how to use the media. We could use your help locally in not just getting stories, but teaching advocates how to communicate. I will say this about the brain science. There was a concerted effort by the foundation community to help that brain science be communicated. So brain architecture, serve and return, those were developed in partnership with communication people. And that's why I think they're so easy to use now, because it was a partnership between the scientific community and the communication community. That's what we need you to do.
I would also, I'd say that creating opportunities for news professionals and for ECD folks to meet one another and come to trust one another in an ongoing communication and as sources and so on is also very important.
Yeah.
Right? That it's not that cold calling on deadline is fine, but it's always better and we'll talk about this tomorrow, it's always better to be developing sources over time so that you have a brain trust and so they know who you are and all that sort of
Right.
thing. And
Exactly.
we can talk a little bit
And I
about
mean,
that.
if there are, authors in here that you would like to follow up, we can't guarantee it, especially, some of the more prominent, prominent leaders in here, but we will do everything we can to try to put you in touch with people.
Cool. So one of the things that really has struck me is how filled with innovation this field is, and it's almost like a crazy clown car that is just going at very intense speed. It's very exciting. What are a couple of your own personal favorite innovations in this field that just get you excited in the morning and remind you that this is still a really fresh and exciting thing? And B, if you were to look forward 5 or 10 years, where do you think the movement is going?
Yeah, those are good questions. I mean, what excites me is this is like a kaleidoscope. It's like a beautiful quilt of things that are going on around the world. It's a movement. I was thinking, I reread it, and I was thinking about my own life. I've been kind of a witness to the evolution of a revolution. And that's what this is about. It's a revolution in thinking about what young children need, which is linked to their future health, learning, and behavior. It's not just during that period. So that kaleidoscope of activity, that you can find a parenting program in Bhutan and Brazil and Boise, Idaho, that's exciting to me. But the things that I'm trying to focus on right now are the place-based strategies, the efforts that are emerging, whether, like we're doing in Urban 95, but we've got community leaders stepping up and saying, I want to be the city where all children have the best chance of being successful. I want to be the best city for babies in X country. And that's really exciting. Because the change is coming from the bottom, not just from the top.
That's great. All right, questions from the room, go.
Great.
No shortage, go.
As you discussed in your presentation, that learning doesn't begin at school. It begins at birth. Yesterday we discussed that uneducated parents, especially the uneducated mothers, can't play a very constructive role in child development. My question is, what if parents are educated, especially mothers, and they do job outside home, and they leave their children or child with a nanny or babysitter from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. while they are at work. And finally, she or he, both the parents, they spend just 2 or 3 hours with their babies. So what will be the impact on babies, on children, while they are far away from their parents for this long time?
It's a question of the day, right? I mean, first of all, let me say something about the first statement. Educated, uneducated, they're all parents, and I don't think one has the edge necessarily over the other. I mean, it's really about the support systems they have that makes the big difference. And when you think about childcare, so the world has changed dramatically since I was young. And every generation, there are more and more women working, and not just in the developed world, but all over the world. What we have in our childcare systems are like dirt paths rather than superhighways that families need. So everywhere people are struggling with this. And so that's why we're concerned about the child. If we had decent childcare systems, those caregivers and parents can work together and still lead to healthy development. It's a partnership between the caregiver and the parent, but we haven't provided either the supports for families or the supports for the substitute caregivers, and that's dangerous.
Thank you, Joan, for your talk. I'm so sorry that I didn't get to meet you when you came to Johannesburg, South Africa.
Yes, yeah, it was Cape Town.
I'm not sure if you're aware of the kind of political climate in South Africa, but essentially the policymakers and the government is very behind putting a lot of money into tertiary education, simply because of past inequities, and suddenly it's become like that. I guess my question to you is, because we kind of probably lag behind in thinking about policy, how long, I really kind of want the government to start thinking more about early childhood development in terms of putting money. I mean, how long is your experience in terms of the lag, or how long does it take? I know it's a difficult question because it's still in progress.
No,
but
I mean, I think, this is the question that I'm getting everywhere. How long is it going to take? It's going to take a long time. It's going to take time. Because as I said, some of these programs are just emerging. We have to learn if they're working. Are they working at scale? What do we have to change? So I think we've got a lot of countervailing forces of pressure on our budgets. I mean, take tertiary education. One of the most significant impacts on child development is maternal education. So I can't, as an early childhood advocate, as an advocate for young children, fight against tertiary education, because I know it makes a difference in mothers' lives. Now, if that tertiary education system doesn't advance the cause of low-income women, I've got problems with it. If all the public money is going to high-end universities that don't serve the needs of low-income families, then I've got issue with it. But otherwise, these are really hard dilemmas.
Okay.
there you go.
Yeah. In one of the states in Nigeria, the governor said that he didn't believe in preschool, and government was not going to put a dime in preschool, so it should be the responsibility of the parents. That he didn't go to preschool, and he eventually became a governor. And so many of his peers did not go to preschool, so he didn't believe in it. And reporting in a country where public understanding of science is very poor. So in this case, how do you get the buy-in of the governor? Is it by naming and shaming? So what kind of approach should a journalist reporting this issue we take to get the leaders to act?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good question. I in my life, I've been less on the shaming and blaming side than on, even though I'm getting close. I think for someone like that is really still believing in an old model of family that is self-sufficient and doesn't rely on community and other services, it's always a challenge. I think you have to bring them along. I think when they talking about fathers, the importance of fathers, talking about their own children, getting them to be a champion, showing them the brain science. I think that's, for people like that, showing the brain science, I think makes all the difference in the world, because they finally get what we're talking about.
Follow up on that. If someone's an investigative reporter, that particular mindset, and really trying to, in a kind of Rachel Carson Silent Spring way, identify the key places that a government, that a society, that a community is failing, what do you think are the key areas or key indicators reporters should look at first? What are the canary in the coal mine issues if you're looking to see where things are not going well?
Well, I think it's straightforward looking at the percentage of low-income kids in poverty. We spend a lot of time in the field trying to develop measures of child development so we can prove that our children are in trouble. But it's my strong belief that the proxy for that is poverty. And, you can look at those poverty numbers and, 43%, almost half the children, and much higher if you look at violence prevalence, of the children that won't meet their developmental potential. What a waste. What a waste of human capital that is. And that's the story.
Yeah. Julie.
So thank you for being here. You showed an earlier slide, I believe it showed preschool coverage around the world, and I don't think the US was on it. And I was just curious, sort of like a multi-parter, first where the US falls in that, and second of all, a whole bunch of us are here from Colorado, and the Democratic candidate for governor right now is proposing state-funded full-day preschool, which, you know, our state is sort of famous for not liking taxes.
Right.
So that's going to be a haul if he wants to do that. And so I was sort of curious how in the U.S., like, are there other states that have this? Like, are there other states that have implemented state-funded preschool or state-funded full-day preschool?
Well, you're in a city where the mayor stepped up and did universal preschool. So I think, we've got momentum, but look, it's shameful that we're so far behind. We have the premier program that I talked about, Head Start, still serving 50% of the eligible children. If you look at 0 to 3, we're talking about 5%. 5% of kids in federal poverty, which is much higher than low income, okay? Much more poorer families. And we're still at 3%, no paid leave. So, the United States really needs to step up on this issue itself, and I think learn from the rest of the world. It's not, for a long time, the knowledge was going out of the U.S. I think it's time for it to come into the U.S.
And I noticed that Latin America was 60% coverage. Is Latin America seen as like the leader in this particular area?
They've had a longer history of investments. I mean, Europe is not on there, and obviously there's high coverage in some of the countries in Europe. But, if you look at the demographics and you get underneath those gross numbers, and you look at the most disenfranchised kids, whether they be indigenous children or, minority group children, the access issues are much higher. I mean, much lower.
Ma'am, you talked about the keeping the fire, going. But do you think that there are enough volunteers, enough, people on the ground who are trained enough to keep the fire going? Secondly, you talked about this relationship between the, NGOs and the journalists, but it's our experience. I don't know about the other subcontinent. Why only journalists are approached when the donors are supposed to come?
Say that again?
Why only journalists are trying, they are approached to report or write when the donor's visit is in the offing? And third and last thing, as my colleague from Afghanistan, he raised this point that how can you exclude the, education of women from the child care? Because, in the Indian subcontinent, if you go, the migration of men is one of the biggest issue.
Right.
So women, they are left alone. Unless you train them, you educate them, childcare cannot be treated in isolation. Do you think this is a problem and this should be addressed?
Yeah, I do, and I think you sound like a real activist for young children, so I'm really thrilled that you're in the room. Look, I mean, especially in many countries where the poverty rates are high, access to food is an issue, pollution is an issue, lack of water is an issue, which is going on now. It's hard to then turn and say, we should talk about child development. So we've got to hook our issues to those issues. I mean, that's what I think.
Would you say, can you think of any places, either countries or even in the U.S. states, where activists, volunteers, activists, have put ECD on the agenda, force leadership to pay attention? What are some good examples?
I think my whole entire field does that every day. But it's been hard to get the attention. I mean, Sally's in the room. There's researchers that have been doing research and trying to get coverage of that research. There are places I can point to, and I think the journal shows that, places that are trying to do pieces of this. Do I think that there's one place that's got it all covered? I don't think so.
Well, what about, just pull you on this a little more. Where not only the experts and advocates are doing the pushing, but is there a place where it's anywhere where it's translated or been absorbed into political
You know, I think
the
if you
political
look
world.
at Scandinavia, they've had amazing policies that are supportive. However, I will say, even there, the test is going to be as these populations change and their populations get more diverse. Will they then be into universal coverage of programs when people start looking different than them? I mean, it's a test now
Yeah, I mean,
about this.
Alex, you sounded like you wanted to. Yeah. Okay, so Nepal is one
Yeah.
place that's
I mean,
enacted it politically. Okay.
One thing about all of the countries that are having policies on the books,
Yeah.
we see policies emerging.
Yeah, okay.
Are they implementing them? That's the
Yeah.
question.
Yeah, okay, so.
They have 75 areas in Nepal, and in 59, there's ECD centers in place and run by government. So in 2014, they actually put it into constitution, and I mean, this is a great success. So Nepal is a real success story.
Yeah,
Remarkable.
Nepal,
Okay.
Bangladesh. I mean, there are solutions emerging. I don't want to paint a negative picture at all. There are very promising things happening, but they're still doing these things on a shoestring budget,
Okay.
and that's the challenge.
Go,
Why?
and then go.
Okay, here from
sorry.
Brazil.
Yeah.
The article here and the Jenny article on the Brazil Criança Feliz, happy child, poor translation. It made me, feel a bit more optimistic about having, good foundation, good professionals, thinking good policies in a bad government. But yeah, that's a problem. So we talked about, Jenny, how to separate policy from politics.
Yeah.
But I find it difficult when you choose a politic to write about a
Yeah.
program. So that's something I was thinking, because in the previous conversations we talk about poverty. We have a government that's actually making people poorer. It froze social investment for 20 years. So when this article came up, it points numbers, and I'm skeptical about these numbers. So I would like to know first if you have not only the funds, but also how to know that, it's impossible that these numbers of Brazilian government are true. In a place that the social investment is frozen, and I'm not talking about just politics, just skeptical journalism, but also as my sister works for social assistance, and the Criança Feliz is I chatted with her briefly right now, and she said, well, Criança Feliz is nice, has good background, but it completely ignores the previous social assistance network. It is hiring very very young assistants and ignoring this
So
previous
let's
social
give Joan
network.
time
sorry,
to
okay.
respond.
Yeah, I mean,
Drop there.
I think you're raising important points in that you as a journalist have to help us follow up to make sure that the numbers really are reality. Any of these numbers, I mean, people are skeptical of public numbers on anything. And I mean, I think that Criança Feliz is a hopeful step forward. Will it fulfill its potential is something that I think we're going to have to continue to watch. Will they use that as an excuse to cut other programs? I think we have to continue to watch that. It's not good enough for me to cut tertiary education to poor women on behalf of young children. That's not what I want to see. So I think it's really great that you raised that as an issue. And I think we have to work with you to make sure that Criança Feliz or any of these solutions that are emerging hold the promise, really fulfill the promise that I think the potential of them will do.
Well, and journalistically, one of the tip sheets that I've found myself yearning for over the last couple of days is how to be an ECD watchdog,
Yeah,
What is
we need
ECD
you to do
watchdog
that.
reporting?
We need you
That's
to
something
do
we
that.
can talk about tomorrow,
Yeah.
and I think that's a valid thing. Dwyer, and then Lynn, and then we'll have to call it quits.
So I'm
Oh,
curious if you are seeing any effort, this kind of goes back to the question before last, but if you're seeing any efforts to build coalitions around early childhood education that are unexpected, like that incorporate the business community, that incorporate maybe even the religious community. There have been a couple cases in the US of successfully doing this in kind of conservative areas, and those cases where it's worked, it's been because a local employer got on board and started also lobbying politicians. So I wonder if you see that.
I mean, I think we see public-private partnerships emerging all over the world. And I think the reason those are important is because they go beyond that particular president. So if, and they're more, they have more longevity, it seems to me, because you can cut through the political divide. I don't want this, whether it be Brazil or anywhere else, to be owned by one single politician or one single party. That's not the way we're going to advance an issue. And if it ends up that way, and I think this is really good feedback for us, that we have to think about who writes for us, to make sure that we're getting the full range of perspectives. I also think in defense of that, when a new program is starting, you often go to the federal officials that are overseeing it. So it's a dilemma.
Okay, so I lied. Two more. One, two. Then we
Hi, I'm really interested, you mentioned minority groups, and I'm really interested in this because in Australia, we obviously have the Aboriginal community,
Yes.
and there's so much history there, lots of, I don't know if you guys are aware of the Stolen Generation, the Australian government thought they would do them a favor and take them away from their parents, etc. And so whenever there are policies involving Aboriginal communities, it's really quite a thorny issue. Implementing policies like this, can be quite traumatizing for communities in Northern Territory or whatever. What are your thoughts on straddling that and kind of being culturally sensitive, particularly
you've got to develop policy with them, not for them. With them. This is not about importing a solution that doesn't work for an indigenous population or any other minority.
go.
You talked about pollution and its effect on the first 1,000 days of life. I'm just curious because we have so many forms of pollutions. So if you could just get into the details of the type of pollutions you're talking about here and their effects on the development of a baby, and also if you could also help us to quantify the problem with the data provided, whether globally or sub-regions. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I mentioned some of the data and some of the data sources that I think you can use that also have data on the first 1,000 days. So, I think the coalitions that we're seeing emerge are best done when they're multi-sectoral, when they have private sector and public sector, and when they involve the communities. So there's a movement that I know you're all seeing of decentralization everywhere. And so the coalitions that are developing at the national level in many countries also are needed at the local level. And so I don't know if that answers your question, but that's my answer.
Okay, well, with that, quickly.
Kindly, maybe I wasn't very clear. If you could elaborate on the pollution. You're talking about
pollution. I'm sorry, pollution.
Yes.
Oh, the coalitions. Well, I think the coalition between young children and those people that know about pollution and climate change hasn't even really begun yet. That was one of the reasons why I wanted the article on pollution, because we have to join forces with the people that really understand climate change, that really understand the impact of pollution on children. I would point you to that Lancet that was referred to in the journal on pollution, the article that was referenced as one of the best sources on this issue. But I think the conversation about the impact of pollution is just starting.
Okay, Jenny is champing at the bit to get in one thing. We've got a mic coming your way. Wait.
It's kind of a plea to you all, actually, because going back to this question of policymakers speaking up against policies, I've actually talked to a lot of people who had very negative things to say about crianza feliz. Not a single one of them wanted to go on the record. And that is an incredibly frustrating position to be in as a journalist, when they're willing to tell you that there's problems so you can paraphrase it. But when it actually comes to saying there's no way they're ever going to get to these numbers, you know, that's a really frustrating position. So I would, I guess, argue that I know it's sometimes challenging professionally, and obviously I don't want people risking their lives, but the flip side of that is we need people to be really forthright as well on the skepticism and being comfortable doing that on the record without sort of throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
I mean, that's the danger of it being identified with one political party. Because, I mean, I'll share one last story, and that's the story of when the Head Start Impact Study came out, you know, which showed no long-term impact of the program. I was directing the agency at the time that had that study, and I could have been defensive, or I could have embraced it. Was the study perfect in my opinion? No. And I won't go into what I thought was wrong with it. But what we did, and what I said to everyone in the program, is let's learn from this. This was on the front page of every newspaper in America. You know, it was just everywhere. That's probably an exaggeration, but it was everywhere. It was on the radio.
It was a big deal.
It was a big deal. And so I was responsible for the program at the time. And what my position was, we're going to embrace the results. We're going to look at the results. We're going to make improvements. We're going to put a quality improvement plan in place. We're going to work with the schools, which are, you know, the kids were going into bad schools. No wonder. You know, there was not continuity of impact. But, you know, it's hard to do that, I'll be honest, because the political response is to get defensive. And I think we have to help everybody, and you have to help us. If Crianza Feliz or any program is not meeting its potential, let's make it better. Let's not throw it out because it belongs to one party or another. Let's make it better. Now, I'm hopeful. I think there's amazing solutions emerging around the world. I'm excited about them, but I don't want bad programs. You know, I want results, but it's not going to happen overnight.
Well, that's a wonderful place to stop. Clearly, the building of bridges between journalists seeking both to educate and ensure accountability on this issue and the community of researchers and advocates who are trying to develop effective social policies. This is a conversation that has to continue. So thank you, Joan, very much.
Thank you for your work.